I was always that incredibly annoying science student. You know, the one who sits right in the front of the class and eagerly waves her hand to answer every one of the teacher's questions. I smugly aced my tests, and I did things like competed in the science Olympiad. I thought I had a great relationship with science. So when I decided to enroll in a PhD program in biology, I assumed that graduate school was going to be smooth sailing as well. And so while my graduate classes were a breeze, I quickly learned that graduate school was a lot more about conducting independent scientific research. This requires a lot of creativity and being okay with failure. These were things that I had never learned to be good at. So it was at that moment that I realized that the science education that we receive in this country does not really set us up to become scientists. It took me even longer to realize how different science education actually is from conducting independent research. And this seemed like a problem. So while I don't believe the scientific method is going to change anytime soon, I think that science education probably needs a change. So when I completed my PhD, I moved back to Tahoe and I started teaching science to high school students in Van Norden Meadow. Now this is one of the biggest, most beautiful meadows in the entire Sierra Nevada. I really wanted to make this experience for the kids both innovative and hands-on. So I had them collect field data. This had been one of the best parts of my own PhD experience. However, these kids did not find it very engaging. So at this point, I clearly did not have it all figured out. One, I knew that doing real science actually is fun. However, collecting data for somebody else's research is not very engaging. So with these observations in mind, two fellow educators and I started the Headwaters Science Institute to try to create a framework to better engage students in the sciences. So during this process, we realized that if students actually ask their own research question, then data collection becomes meaningful and the students are a lot more engaged in the sciences. So from there, I want to explain a little bit about student-driven research. This framework, just to oversimplify it, was a lot like the steps I went through in my PhD process, only we had to adjust it to work with younger kids. This meant more mentorship, and students had a tighter time frame, maybe only 1 or 2 days to collect data instead of years. But the important parts here were that the students were their own primary investigators on the research project, and this control of their project and ownership really gave them a much stronger relationship to the sciences. So, for example, I was working with students recently right here at North Tahoe Middle School, and these students spent 3 days investigating how erosion was affecting their schoolyard and potentially the lake itself. Now, can you think of a better way to keep Tahoe blue than by challenging students to study this amazing lake and one of its biggest threats firsthand? So now let's just step back for a minute and think about the state of science education in the US. So while there's no doubt that America is creating some of the top scientific research in the world, when we actually look at science education that we're getting in grade school, we're not doing so well. In most comparisons of international countries, the US ranks just somewhere right in the middle of the pack. And maybe even more worrisome is a 2015 Pew Research study that shows that 46% of members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science believe that STEM education in this country is below average. So what do you remember from your high school science class? Do you remember your heavy textbook? Maybe wearing some lab goggles? The Bunsen burner? How about the Krebs cycle? You guys remember every step of the Krebs cycle, right? You could repeat this back to me? Well, the trouble is, even if you remember these things, most of what we do in science education is not really science. We are really learning about the history of scientific discovery and advancement. Now, you may be thinking, what about my science labs? If you think about that, it's really just an experience that allows you to go step by step through something like following a script. So I don't think students actually feel much ownership over the science labs that they do in school. So what is real science? Let's think about the steps of the scientific method. I'm sure you had to memorize these in school. So first, you ask a question, then you test a hypothesis, you need to write some methods, gather some data, make an analysis, and then draw some conclusions. What does it feel like to take these steps? Is it fun or exciting? The vast majority of Americans don't know because they never had the experience of being able to do real science education. Let's think about this for a minute. Would it be okay for English students to have to wait until after they were done college to be able to analyze literature? Or productive for foreign language learners to wait until they were out of college to actually speak Spanish? So why is science education so different? One, because it hasn't really changed in decades. And two, probably because of an untested assumption that says that students aren't ready to undertake the rigors of real science education until they are much older. Now, I have worked with kids as young as age 5, and this is not true. These students are energized by and engaged by doing real science. In fact, some of the simple questions they ask, like, what's a bird's favorite food? Or what's an insect's favorite color? These make just as great questions to start a research project as the ones that older teens take. So now, how can we reshape this relationship between science and education? I believe that it is valuable and practical for real science research to come to every science class. It starts with being able to have a framework that can be done anywhere in your science class, maybe an urban park or even a wilderness area. And also, in this framework, students need to be able to just use the tools that are found in their standard science class. When I work with students, if they can't find something they need, they're also very good at jury-rigging things out of things like household recycling. What is SDR, or student-driven research? This is a process that students go through that really lets them experience all the steps of the scientific method. We have them start by asking a question. And here, during this question-asking process, we ask them to put everything aside, all judgment, and just ask as many questions as they can. And during this process, we try not to control the questions that they ask or influence them. It's really important that this is their own. As students move through the question process, they need to narrow them down, and they form into small groups that the students work with based around their own interest. Next, the students create a hypothesis off their question, and this is really important so they can figure out which part of their questions are actually testable. Then, as the students move into developing their methods, we find that the key to success here is that the students are able to develop their own methods rather than just looking something up on the internet. One of the inevitable things about giving students control of their own project, though, is failure. I really like to think of this more like trial and error, though. These failures can come in all shapes and sizes. For example, we had students that really wanted to take measurements all the way across the Truckee River, and they had no idea how deep this river actually was until they got there, and they clearly did not come prepared to swim. So these students quickly rearranged their projects so that they could take measurements up and down the riverbank instead. These types of failures, we try not to prevent them. Instead, these are great learning experiences for the students and really allows them to actually create better projects in the end. Next, they move into data collection, and it's here where their ownership of their project is really important. I have seen students pick up thousands of pieces of ash fragments from a huge wildfire, or do things like take a sample every 100 meters along a 3-mile transect. This is incredibly tedious work. These students would never spend even a fraction of the time or energy to do something like this for a project that was somebody else's. So after they finish their data collection, they move on to statistical analysis. And this is where their comfort level with their own data is really important. It really helps them tackle complex mathematical problems. And I don't think if they didn't have this familiarity that they would be able to do this. They're also really motivated because they want to figure out an answer and draw a conclusion to their project. We end this process by having the students do oral presentations, and this is really great for their confidence and their public speaking skills. We always have teachers comment here how amazing the students are at talking about their own research and being able to answer questions on the spot. So that's student-driven research in a nutshell. But what can we really gain from a new relationship with science, the students and the country in general? I think that by injecting curiosity into science, we are going to reach kids that have never been interested before. I think that curiosity can actually be a leveling factor that makes science more accessible and tangible to students of all races, genders, and socioeconomic backgrounds. But I think scientific research is not just key for people that want to be scientists, but for everybody. Scientific research teaches us a real analytical thinking process, and this is useful in everyday problem solving. In addition, it will help us think about things like, say, climate change. So while there's scientific consensus that humans are causing climate change, there's still millions of Americans that somehow refuse to believe this is real. So I think with a little bit better understanding of the scientific process, that would be harder for those people to deny. Where do we go from here? Well, I'm just 3 years into this process and still millions of students away from seeing real science come to all science classrooms. But I think that with a little help, we can help spread this idea from the shores of Lake Tahoe to students of every demographic and every corner of this nation. Thank you.